Hi, welcome back to the Kerbal Space Program series. Again, obviously I mentioned it in the last episode, basically all the commentaries had to have been re-added post-production. Again, apologies for that, but don't know why these two episodes just recorded with no commentary for some reason. But anyway, basically we have those new rockets. So we have the beginning of what I wanted to be a deep space probe. And this episode contains the launchers for the deep space probe that I designed. The downside is that it doesn't quite have enough delta V in its current form to work effectively as a deep space probe. It leaves the atmosphere and enters space. That is a landmark for us in this playthrough. We actually enter space this time around. This episode basically allowed us to get so much science. I have unlocked a chunk of the tech tree. I was, as you are going to see throughout this episode, basically plagued by test flight failures. It did, however, show that my rocket design is fairly resilient, because on 2 of the 5 occasions, what happened is even though we experienced engine failure, we still managed to make it into either high atmosphere or space. The drawback at the moment is that the current control modules I have for satellites don't seem to have any kind of SAS torsion wheels built into them. So they're okay using the gimbals to control the direction, but once you are actually no longer under gimbaled thrust, it can't control the direction that the probe is pointing in. So I need some more configurations unlocking for the avionics packages and procedural stuff. So obviously that was the first engine failure. It was a loss of thrust on one of the engines, which is why I've now ended up at 45 degrees, because it was one of the peripheral engines. So what I did is part of the spacecraft design allows me to basically ditch the side extra engines anyway. I'll show you that in the VAB after this launch. But yeah, it's the first. It put the launch at too much of an acute angle for the aerodynamic forces, and as a result, it broke itself to pieces. So you get a sneak peek at the probe. It's not perfect by any stretch of the means. It's just a simple probe body. It does have about 1400 meters a second of delta V in it, which would be enough for it to go very high above the Earth's atmosphere, Earth's sort of atmosphere into space. But due to the reaction wheel issues and control module surfaces and configurations that I have available to me at the moment, I can't fully utilize the available delta V because it cannot be pointed in the correct direction permanently. As a result, I can do a quick burn while it still points in the direction, but as it deviates off, I have to kill the thrust. And unfortunately, obviously the Aerobee is a single ignition engine in this configuration, so we're a little limited at the moment. The good news is this rocket design can really easily be adapted. All I have to do, apologies for your ears, that was a ridiculous volume and it caught me out while I was recording as well. But yeah, so all I have to do is basically change the engine configuration of this, and the launch capability using the Atlas bodies far exceeds what we've ever had before. But since that first launch was a marginal failure, I will now I'll go through the quick design of the rocket for you. It's nothing special. It basically uses the Atlas launch stage. That's effectively it. So once I get the engine configurations and the control required to orient the rocket correctly at all stages, then we'll be fine for getting into a low Earth orbit, I believe. So, but yes, anyhow, this is a closer look at what it is. And as you can see, it's simple Atlas base with the Atlas fairing. And what I've done is just chucked the payload on top, rather than obviously the capsule that would take the Kerbals to orbit. So as you can see, there's two external engines on the outside of the fairing, which is fuel cross-feed enabled. And then in the core part of the spacecraft, I'm just highlighting the fact that I have enough thruster weight there. But in the core, you'll see me remove this there. And then there's another two engines there in the core center stage. So the 4 engines are just to give us the thruster weight. So obviously, as you can see, with 2 engines, we don't have enough. So we use 4 just to give us the thruster weight, and then the final 2 to take us into the last stages of the launch. You've already kind of seen it once, but this is the probe body. As you can see, it's just a Sputnik probe, some antennas for mass science transmission quickly, in case we have to do it before losing signal or connection or something like that. Want parallel signals so that things can be parallel processed. And that's kind of it, really. It's I've had to counterbalance that huge magnetic boom by chucking all of the scientific experiments on one side, except the magnometer boom. But actually, I did manage to get the balancing almost perfect. As you can see, the torque on that is almost 0. So yes, onto the launch of a second instance of the rocket. And pretty sure, if I remember correctly, we have another instance of a launch failure. I'm all but sure, it's just launch failure after launch failure because of the test data add-on that's part of Realism. You know, the Realistic Overhaul Pack, the Realism options. I could turn it off, but I don't see the point of turning it off. It is, I mean, this is a possibility. So there you can see engine failure. And this is me basically, all I was trying to do was decide what to do. And in the end, I decided that actually, because of the design of the craft, if I shut down the middle engine, the remaining middle engine at a later stage, it will actually be able to use the 2 external engines permanently. But it has, obviously, as you can see, it has hampered our thrust to weight ratio at the initial launch phase. And you can see, look, there's an asymmetrical burn now because one of the engines is dead. As a result, it does get a little wobbly, but luckily the gimbaling of the other remaining engines is enough to actually counteract the torque induced by having an asymmetrical engine burn. So basically, I just decide to go up on 3 engines, and as we get higher up through the atmosphere, I just kill that remaining center engine, just get rid of the asymmetrical burn. Effectively, all this allows us to do is use those 2 side engines as the main engines. That's it. We just won't jettison the fairing in those 2 engines. They have now become our main launch phase. It's pretty much an uneventful launch. Up until I believe there's a further test data failure. And there's the test flight. That second engine exceeded its, obviously because they exceeded the burn time, it failed. Just engine shutdown, critical failure, which unfortunately basically terminated the ability for us to use any further thrust because it put us into this spin. So I do try as it rotates just to ignite the very, very high upper stage engines just to see if I can get a little bit of usable delta V out of this top stage, just to push the apoapsis as high as possible. The other good news is we do drift out far enough to obtain more science. So this is all new biome science. You see what I mean, though, about having multiple antennas, allowing for parallel processing of different science data. What is funny as well is not only did we have two failures on the lower stage, but then if you notice, one of the upper stage solid separatrons, solid booster separatrons, actually also experienced thrust loss. So... fulfill some contracts. But yes, test flight data did not do us any favors this episode, unfortunately. We were just inundated with failures. Yeah, so that was one flight. And effectively all we do is we obviously had multiple of these rockets queued up, ready for usage. I'm going to obviously do you a favor and squash the launch into 4 times speed. But we are inundated with test failures for almost every single launch. And then the funny thing is when we do get a decent launch with no engine failures, I go and blow up the launch pad, which you'll see later on. So yes, so here is another attempt. Yeah, so as you can see, relatively decent launch. I actually thought there was an engine failure on that one, but obviously downside of doing post commentary, I'm reapplying all my comments. So that one obviously didn't actually have an engine failure, and that one went pretty well. The one that just happened is, again, just ridiculous of the look I was having at the time, whereby all the engines ignited, but the staging blew the release clamps before the engines were up to thrust. As a result, it fell onto the landing pad, smashed the launch pad. It was not great. So it was. We had a bit of rough luck with RNG on test flight, and then just staging mistakes and all that stuff. So, The main bulk of this flight, as you will see, is me attempting to have a much more entry to orbit launch profile than the one that we have been doing, which is this idea of straight up, straight down, trying to get the altitude records and get as deep into space as possible. Once I realized that we couldn't possibly make it into deep space because of the lack of control in the in the final probe stage, I figured why not see if we've got enough delta V natively just to push it into a new biome other than over the water. So this obviously, as you will see, is me trying to get a much more orbital launch profile. So again, I shall zip through the launch for you and catch up after, just to give you a summary. So as you can see, we got about I don't know, a fifth of an orbit done there. But yeah, it's mainly limited by the fact I can't control the orientation of the craft in the upper stages because of the lack of SAS and torque wheels in there. But as you can see, we unlocked a load of science that episode. So thanks for joining. Shall see you next time.